On this episode, we fix a broken control arm and take care of some maintenance items on a 1968 Cougar. Alright, as mentioned, we have a 1968 Mercury Cougar here that we've got to do some repairs to, and it needs a few items taken care of on it, maintenance wise, some leaks, just some things we need to take care of on this car. I've been working on this car for quite a few years now, and I've actually built the engine that's in this car, and I've done a lot of maintenance on it over the years for the person that owns this car. And a few weeks ago they were out driving the car and heard a thud in the front end, and then the car got very hard to steer. So when I went over to check on the car to see what had happened, I had found something that I have never seen in all my years working on these older cars. If you look in here, this is the upper control arm here, and you got your coil spring that sits on top of the arm, shock in the center there. Well, back here where the bushing normally would be, you can see the arm has tore out the end, and that allowed the whole control arm to pivot forward because it's still attached on the other side, and that made it extremely difficult to drive. Now, they did make it home with this car. How, I'm not sure after I seen what was going on with it, but we need to get these arms replaced. I've already purchased a pair of arms. We're going to go ahead and do both sides because I'm not sure the condition of the other side. The arms are reasonable enough in price. We're just going to replace them both. We're going to put a new set of shocks in it. Some of the work I've done to this car previously, probably about 6 years ago, I redid most of the front suspension on this car. I put new lower control arms in it at that time. I replaced the tie rods. I replaced the ball joints, uppers and lowers. So these ball joints are new, unfortunately. The new ones come with new ball joints, so these are not needed anymore. And a few other things was done at that time. So it's not due to lack of maintenance. These control arms are really hard to see what kind of shape the bushings are in, so nobody knew just by looking at them whether or not they were wearing away. So we're going to go ahead and take care of what we need to fix here with the control arms. We're also going to look into redoing the front brakes because the rotors themselves are a little thin, and as you can see, this pad decided it wanted to slip out of this caliper for some reason. So we've got to figure out what's going on there and get this taken care of so the brakes are good on the car again, and they can get back to enjoying driving this classic Cougar. Alright, one of the first things I want to do before I start taking any of this apart to get this spring off of the upper control arm so I can change it out, I want to try and get the arm pulled back in position where it was at, so that the spring is not so out of position itself. So what I've done is just taken a ratchet strap, wrapped it around the top of the spindle, and anchored it underneath the car here. And as I crank this, tighten this strap up, it pulls the arm back closer into position where it should be. So my spring is now more straight for when I put my compressor tool in here and try to take the pressure off of the upper control arm. Alright, after pulling my control arm back into position closer, I unhooked my shock at the bottom. Now I've got to take out this top shock mount, which I'm probably going to have to take off these supports here that they have on these cars that goes from the firewall out here to the shock tower. So we'll go ahead and take out, there's 3 bolts that hold this mount here on, and 2 of them are attached to this piece here. So we'll go ahead and get these unhooked. Take this shock mount up loose, and this will allow the shock to come out, and then we can proceed with getting our spring compressor down here to go down and compress the spring and pull the tension off so that the control arm can come out. Okay, I've got all my nuts, my retaining nuts off of the upper shock bracket, and I can just pull this up out of the way so I don't really have to remove it. And we just slide our shock out around it. And I tell you, it's a good thing that we're replacing these shocks because they are done. Alright, I've got my spring compressor installed and my center rod down through the spring, as you can see it there. And I've got a wrench on top with another nut. Now I'm going to have to let the car down so that I can turn this nut in and pull that spring up to take the tension off as much as I can and get it off of this. Hopefully it'll take it up enough to get it off of that control arm so I can get everything changed out. Alright, okay, this has got our spring pulled up off of that perch that's on top of the upper control arm. So technically I should be able to loosen the two retaining bolts that are down the bottom of this shock tower that hold the control arm to the body, and then separate the upper ball joint from the spindle and take that control arm out and be able to put the new one back in. Okay, so where we are now, I've got my retaining nuts removed on the inside of the shock tower, so the top of this arm is loose. I need to take my nut off my ball joint here and separate the ball joint from the spindle, and that'll leave the arm free. Now there's still a little bit of tension on this spring. I probably should have tried to grab one more coil down to get this pulled up, but with the angle everything was at, it was still a little cockeyed in here. I couldn't quite get on the spring where I wanted to. So we'll have to see how this all comes apart. Some of you Ford guys out there may be going, oh come on man, that's an easy job changing those control arms out. I'm not a Ford guy. This is actually the first set of these upper control arms I've ever done on a Ford with the upper spring mount. So this is all a learning curve for me too. Most of the time you can take your upper nut off, and if you can get a good shot on the top of the spindle where it goes through, it'll shock it and it'll release it. I can't quite get my steering to turn where I want it to be and get a good shot on that end to get good video footage for you guys to watch this. So I'm going to use a pickle fork to separate this. Since I am not reusing this upper ball joint, it doesn't matter if I tear the boot up. Alright, I undid my strut rod here off my lower control arm to get a little bit more lower arm to be able to drop down. And I think because this thing is so whacked out of place that it's just giving me a hard time. Up and out. There it goes. Alright. Now, let's see. Okay. Alright, there's our arm. And as you can see, this is what happened to it. It just tore right out of the end of it. I don't know why it did that, but you can see the thickness of that arm on there. But I guess it had just wore it through the bushing that's on here, and it just finally wore it thin enough that it was able to tear it open. So we're going to go ahead and we got to remove this mount from the old arm. I'll clean it up a little bit, get it installed on our new arm, and then we can put the new arm into the car. Okay, so we're going to swap over the spring perch from the old control arm to the new one. And just to show you how these bushings are in these arms, if you're GM familiar, these are very similar to the lower control arms on the C10 pickups back in the 60s, early 70s, same type. It's got a screw-on cap that goes in. There's a rubber bushing on the inside of it, and that's just what kind of bushing it is. And that's kind of probably why it wore through the arm. As you can see here on this is the one that broke. You can see where it was wearing at right here, wore up against here, and eventually it just got to the point where it was weak enough that it tore the arm, and that's what caused the whole problem. So we're going to go ahead and get this spring perch swapped. So this is the perch that our coil spring sits on top of the arm, and you'll notice it's got some rubber pads here. The front one is now missing, so I'll have to make a new piece for there. But these just sit in the arm like so. Now I have loosened these caps, which allows this to have some ability to turn, so it'll make it easier to get into the car. And then once it's in there and the weight's back on the car, I can tighten these two bushing caps up, and that'll leave the arm to where it moves freely. Also need to add a couple of grease fittings in the ends of these, which come with the arm, but it comes with a straight grease fitting. So I don't understand how they expect you to be able to get into a space this big with a straight fitting to grease it. That was an issue before because somebody cut some holes in the shock tower in order to get at the grease fittings. But I have a box of Zerk fittings, they're called, technical term, that are a 90 degree angle, so I will install those on these arms so that I can get in there and grease this periodically when it needs to be. Alright, so we're going to install our arm now in the car. Just got to get it slipped up behind the spring. Line up our brake line. There we go. Line up our two studs that go through. A little tight fit, but it's in, seated up against the back of the shock tower. So now comes the fun part. You need to, wow. I think I'm going to have to compress my spring a little bit further to try and get this pulled up tighter so that this bottom will slip into that spring perch at the back. But first thing I'm going to do is get a couple of the nuts on the mounting studs so it'll hold it into the shock tower. Alright, so I got my nuts on my cross shaft mounting studs down below so the arm doesn't want to kick out on me at all. And I'm just going to put some more turns on this spring to try and pull it up a little bit further so it'll go in on that arm a little bit easier. Again, we want to work smarter, not harder. So we'll just get this spring tightened up a little bit more. And again, I've got a video that's going to come out on just how I fabricated this tool for compressing the springs on these Ford cars with the upper spring mount. It's worked out really well so far. I was going to cut this down and make this shorter, but I think for now I'm going to leave it this length. It does fit in here just fine. I can get everything set in and usable that way, and I think it may be more versatile if I leave the threaded rod at a longer length. A little bit further and that spring should slip right in there. Alright, I think that's about what we're going to get out of it. So let's go back down below. Okay, so I've got my spring pulled up about as far as I really want to pull it up. Still going to have to try and push our spring into position. Don't know if I can get that any tighter, to be honest with you. I'll probably go a little bit more on the spring. But I'm going to try and see if I can get it to slip in there. Okay, I can get the spring in. I got my ball joint back in my upper spindle mount, and I just reattached my strut rod to the lower control arm so that this won't want to drop down too much. And as you can see, this will push in there. Set this down. I may have to set it down on the ground. Put a jack stand under the lower control arm to put some weight to push up on the suspension. Then I can kick the spring into its perch, or onto its perch, I should say. And while that's sitting there with the weight on it, I can loosen up my compression tool, and that'll put the weight back on the spring, which will keep it in place on its perch. Okay, I've got some weight on the bottom of my control arm using a jack stand. I let the lift down till it just touched it. That pushes the arm up enough so that I can get a pry bar in here on the spring and push it over top. There's a slight valley right here that the spring sits into, and once I get that back over there, on top of that, this end here will slip into where it's supposed to be, and that'll leave the spring where it needs to be, and that'll allow us to undo the tension off the spring. Alright, so I'm going to try something different here. We're just going to give the spring a whack. There it goes. That sat it down into its perch. Now we have to see, there's a way to get this rubber insulator in here on this end of the spring. Probably not. Okay, so we got that slipped in. All right. I do believe that will leave the spring where it needs to be, so we can start unwinding our coil spring. Okay, so we dropped our shock down through the shock tower, through the spring, and lined up our holes down here on the spring perch. Got everything tightened up, got the top mount tightened back up. So that pretty much is going to cover the installation on these upper control arms on these Ford products. It's the same for a Mustang as it is for a Cougar. Last couple things we've got to do, just tighten up some of the hardware, tighten up my upper ball joint nut, the strut rod nuts, and drop the car back down, put some weight on it, and then tighten up our bushing nuts for our cross shaft. And then we'll do a final tighten on our Zerk fittings here, and we'll go ahead and grease our Zerk fittings, our bushings, and our upper ball joint, and that'll leave this job complete. So I hope this was helpful to you if you have this project ahead of you at home. And if you haven't done so, again, subscribe to the channel, give me some likes, leave me some comments, and make sure to stay tuned for some more repairs coming up on this Cougar.